Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scott Bertram.
We continue a series of episodes from presentations delivered at Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence seminars. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office, offers educators the opportunity to deepen their content knowledge and refine their skills in the classroom. These one-day conferences are hosted during the academic year in cities across the nation and feature presentations by Hillsdale College faculty, K-12 office staff, and leaders in the Hillsdale network of member schools. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. Currently, the Hoogland Center is hosting a series exploring the art of teaching a variety of subjects. To learn more about upcoming events, visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu.
You'll find that throughout the day today, I think you'll get a lot of practical advice, a lot of thoughtful counsel about practices, but the decision was made to start maybe a little bit more theoretical. And I said I live up in the clouds in the ivory tower, so they said that Dr. Beier, he's the perfect guy to get abstract early in the morning. So I hope you've had your first cup of coffee. But my charge is to talk to you about grammar as a liberal art. I suspect many in the room love grammar, teach grammar. You might identify as a so-called grammar nerd. Maybe you can, sing your way through the prepositions alphabetically too. And yet, even for those of us who love grammar, I think there's still this sort of visceral reaction when we hear the word, grammar, that sounds tedious, that sounds scary. How could people care so much about something that matters so little? This is not a new prejudice. You can see there at the top of the sheet, in the 2nd century AD, a guy named Gellius remarks, "I saw two grammarians of no small repute in a violent dispute over some trifling grammatical matters." So grammarians have this way of just sort of caring so much about these teeny little details. And so if you still kind of carry a little bit of that association for grammar with you, or maybe you're even more suspicious than I'm giving you credit for, I hope that we can reimagine what grammar actually is, what it means to talk about grammar as a liberal art in the time that we have this morning. But to talk about grammar as a liberal art, I think we first of all have to talk about the liberal arts. Maybe you have your own children who are college age or preparing to go to college, and you're getting all this literature in the mail and online, and you make college visits. And most colleges, large research institutions, little itty-bitty places where you blink and their town is passed, right? They almost all give some sort of lip service to the liberal arts. We'll give your child a liberal arts education. But if you push on that, I think that different places mean very different things when they say liberal arts, liberal education. So if I'm going to say grammar is a liberal art, I think first of all we've got to pin down what is a liberal art. So I'd like to begin with this picture that you see on the top left of the handout. This picture is a typus you can see in the banner in the clouds, which we might render as an allegory. So this is an allegory of a liberal education circa 1504. And I would argue that this allegory, this picture, is loosely representative of what education was thought to be in the West in late antiquity, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, and in certain places even up to the present day. And so the idea, if this is allegorical, is that the fresh-faced young child there at the bottom left is an image, is a type of the mind, right? We all start so rosy-cheeked and innocent, and is being invited in to this tower that the boy must ascend. And so the first couple of rooms, we might think of them as dungeons, are labeled Donatus and Priscian, and those were authors of grammar textbooks. And once you can pass through those dungeons of grammar and make it to the terrace, the lowest terrace, you pass through the room of Aristotle's logic and Tully, which is a diminutive, affectionate way of talking about Cicero's rhetoric. And then you have a room for arithmetic and geometry and astronomy and music. And then you've got the final two rooms and the tip top of the tower. And so there in that sort of final triangle on the bottom left angle, it's labeled physics. We might think of that as study of the natural world, the cosmos. On the right, it's labeled morals. We might say all the human things, all the artifacts of human culture, the human being. And then finally, the tip top is theology. And you know, it's a bit of a mystery to me, the fat guy at the top. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be evocative of theology, or it might be, this is my preferred interpretation, it might be that this is the same person as the boy at the bottom. That once you've passed through, once you've ascended through all these rooms, all these terraces, your mind is no longer sort of, young and supple and spry. It's a wise, fat, old mind that you've got there. So this is something of a liberal education, but then the first 7 stops are the liberal arts. That is, the liberal arts are 7 subjects: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music. Those are the liberal arts. And they're seen traditionally to be preparatory, sometimes called propedeutic, before paideia, before wisdom. Because if you study words in these 3 different aspects, grammatically, logically, rhetorically, and you study number in 4 different aspects with respect to arithmetic, pure abstract number, geometry, number as it extends in space, music meaning number in time, and astronomy meaning number in time and space. So you've got the 3 arts of language, the 4 arts of number. Those are the liberal arts, the 7 liberal arts. Then you have a mastery that prepares you for high study, for deep study, divided in 3 ways. Basically to study all that is, everything, whether it's the natural world, the human being, or God. Or perhaps I shouldn't use the word or, I should say and. You want to study all 3 of those fields once you have mastery of word and number. So grammar is a liberal art traditionally, first of all, in this sense that it's preparatory. It's preparatory unto higher things. But I don't think that is all there is to say about the liberal arts, because that specifier, that adjective, there I go with grammar, liberal, what is it indicating? For the people who made this picture, when they think of any art, it's a body of knowledge that's ordered towards production, that's ordered towards making. So, for instance, the baker in his or her art makes baked goods. The sculptor in his or her art makes sculptures. The physician in his or her art makes health in the patient when all goes well. So that's the meaning of art, it's making. And the non-liberal arts, the common arts, the everyday arts, produce artifacts that are outside of the artisan, right? So the loaf of bread, the artisanal loaf that we all enjoy, maybe you learned during COVID how to make one, right? That's clearly outside of the baker. But the liberal arts are liberal because the making doesn't leave the maker. That is, there's something about our nature, our essence as human beings, that we're wordish, we're tongue movers, we reason, we argue about right and wrong in the assembly. That's just part of the human thing. And so when we possess knowledge of grammar, suddenly that wordishness we're able to execute with a greater correctness, a greater ease, even a greater pleasure. We've actualized some potential in our nature. We're becoming, as the poet Pindar says, we're becoming who we are, which is a peculiar thing to say. But that's the liberal art. We remake ourselves, we actualize our distinctly human potential. So the rose in full flower, as Sister Miriam Joseph remarks, right, blossoms, and that's just the rose at its best. That's different than the table outside the carpenter. It's just the rose. So we kind of bring into blossom our being when we possess the 7 liberal arts, or even when we just possess one of those arts like grammar. Finally, while I think liberal is indicating that we remake ourselves or actualize our innate potential, liberal means that, but it also has that sense of liberate, right, of liber, of free. And so historically, when in antiquity people are speaking of the liberal arts, part of what they mean is that liberal arts are the studies of the free man, that he frankly has the time, has the means to pursue these studies when slaves and others do not have that time, that freedom. And so I think some people say, oh, liberal arts, that's elitist. But in fact, across the centuries, I think there's been a deepening of appreciation that it need not be elitist, right? In fact, any human being who puts his or her mind to it can come to a deeper possession of grammar, of logic, of rhetoric, and thereby is freeing oneself, right? To articulate oneself, to understand, to think with greater clarity, to possess things that are true. That is, it's not just about being sort of externally free, but it's about freeing oneself to think and to speak clearly and well, and that's available through education in our society to all, not to a few. So that's sort of a few thoughts about the liberal arts and what they have been, what they are. And we're now ready to turn to grammar. What is grammar? How is grammar a liberal art? Well, I think we should begin again with our pretty picture. So this is lady grammar, right? An allegorized lady who's inviting in the fresh-faced boy. Grammar is the gateway It's the thing that's first in time. And so this beautiful lady tries to sort of entice and welcome the student to an ascent that will admittedly be difficult. But she has, you can see there, the key, right, to unlock everything else in one hand. And in the other hand, the alphabet, right? Grammar, in its very beginning, is simply the learning of letters. So the Greek word gramma, or plural grammata, from which we get grammar, is the word for letter or letters. Grammar is the study of letters. But is that it, right? Sort of A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Okay, right, we've done grammar, on to the next thing. I think that letters are the beginning of grammar, are essential to grammar, but they're not the whole of grammar. But I think it's really good to just pause and see how basic the beginnings of grammar are. And sometimes in our society, I think we underappreciate the importance of the basics, of the very first things. But an authority like Plato's Socrates remarks in Republic that in learning, right, the beginning is the most important part, the most profound part, because a student's first experience with, in this case, letters, it's going to sort of impress something on the soul that's going to be sort of hard to shake. And that's wonderful if what is given is good, is excellent. And that's a great problem and challenge for the individual and for society if that which is impressed is off the mark or not quite what it should be. So grammar is important. The alphabet is important. But grammar, I've said, is more than the alphabet, right? You've got the little tablet with the alphabet on it in the picture, but then there's two whole dungeons dedicated to grammar, the Donatist dungeon and the Priscian dungeon. So what else is grammar beyond learning the alphabet traditionally? The very first definition that we have of grammar comes from Dionysius of Thrax, who was born in about 170 BC. And he gives a lengthy account of grammar, and then a whole book of teachings to follow up on his definition. I won't read his whole definition, but I'll just give you a couple parts of it. He says, grammar is an experimental knowledge of the usages of language as generally current among poets and prose writers. It includes learning how to read, explaining poetic figures and allusions, and finally includes the criticism of poetical productions, which is the noblest part of grammatical art. So that's spacious. That's not just the alphabet. It's right. Okay, there's the alphabet, there's usage, there's learning how to read, but then all of a sudden it's criticism of poetry. Basically, reading stories, understanding them, delighting in them, interpreting them. That includes, right, a whole sort of segment of the language arts or the humanities that I don't think we often associate with grammar. So grammar is really, really big, does a lot. And what happens in Dionysius' treatise, and this is true of the Priscian and the Donatists that I've mentioned a few times as well, is they build things up bit by bit in their textbooks. That first you learn letters, and then you learn syllables, and then you learn words and divide words up according to the parts of speech. And then you think about fitting words together into sentences, and ultimately you think about the finest sentences, the best sentences that have been written by the poets and prose writers of the language being studied. I think that has interesting resonances, interesting analogs with our own practices. You can catch almost a hidden phonics curriculum in that sequence there, letters unto syllables, unto words. And if you, for instance, were to open up the Donatists, I think you'd be surprised when it gets really heady about understanding, criticizing the poets. You'd be surprised with how very practical the text is. It's in some way anticipating the way that different confessions would write catechisms in times of the Renaissance and the Reformation, and even in the United States in the last 200 years, you get these question and answer textbooks that were often very well fitted to a schoolroom that has no books, that has no writing instruments, that has no blackboards. The teacher could ask a question and the students could respond, and the teacher, perhaps owning the only book, would have the script of both parts available to him. And so the teacher, he or she might say, how many parts of speech are there? 8. What are they? Noun, verb, etc. What is a noun? And it's just this very sort of small, practical back and forth that's in those textbooks that ultimately gives something like the elements of grammar, right? The nuts and bolts of words. Quintilian, who's 1st century AD, I think distills this tradition. He's well after Dionysius of Phrax, well before Priscian and Donatus, distills this sort of large view of grammar really succinctly, and so I put it there on your handout. He says, grammar is the study of correct speech, right? The elements of speech, the parts of speech, that kind of thing, and the interpretation of the poets. So the very kind of fine-grained thing, grammar gets this reputation for being tedious. It's in that sort of first part, and then this sweeping huge thing, the interpretation of the poets. For Quintilian, he was thinking in a Roman context where the younger students went and learned from the grammaticus. That's the name of the teacher who gives the elements of language. And then at some point, those students are passed on to the rhetor, who's going to do the higher level teaching in putting together whole speeches, speaking persuasively. And so grammar is there in a very practical way first, and passing people on to another way of using words. But if you're a teacher, you might be asking, even with an understandable impatience, but what did this actually look like? How did this actually work? If maybe there's something that I could borrow or assimilate or learn from, and the sort of call and response of what are the parts in speech doesn't really sound helpful, because now we have blackboards and everybody has a book and a writing instrument and things. So I'd like to read this rather lengthy quote on the handout from a contemporary historian, because he, I think, gives us a little bit more on, day in and day out, what did this instruction look like that moved from the elements of language to considering the greatest, most beautiful poetic productions of the tongue. Robert A. Castor says, the knowledge of correct speech the grammarian conveyed as a set of rules governing phonology, morphology, and the behavior of individual parts of speech. Though syntax had been brought into the ambit of grammar in Greek before the end of the 2nd century, it took a while for it to come into Latin education. Explication of the poets combined the study of language as its larger part with the historical and ethical instruction. So grammar included the study of letters. Sometimes we'll encounter, good letters, humane letters, that means, poems and oratory and history. You can see here, right, the interpretation of the poets, of the letters, is this sweeping thing. The grammar instructor is teaching history, is teaching ethics. How does he or she do so? In line by line and word by word progress through the text. The poet's language was explained and used as a tool to confirm the grammarian's rules. Persons, events, and other historical aspects and the swatches of philosophical and religious doctrine with which the author was supposed to have draped his verse were glossed as they occurred. The action of men and gods were explained and judged in terms of the accepted mores and were so used to confirm them. So when we turn from the elements of language to poetical productions, to literature, to history, to oratory, it's not taught in great books seminar. It's not just sort of, here's the Aeneid, it's the teacher, it's the wise thing, let's talk about it in generalities. Rather, it's going through the text a sentence at a time. Today, students, we're going to discuss the sentence, when thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. And once that's sufficiently parsed, then it's on to the next sentence and to the next sentence. Jean Leclerc, and he's thinking especially about how grammar was taught in the Middle Ages, gives even a little bit more insight with a happy brevity. He says in the subsequent quotation, authorities on Latinity were studied in three principal ways: the introduction to the authors, accessus ad auctores, commentary or explanation of the texts, and lastly, copying. One of the interesting things is that Castor is thinking about late antiquity, where a lot of the students were learning Latin grammar, having a background in Latin language. But now, in the Middle Ages, Leclerc's thinking of especially monks who speak some sort of dialect that is not Latin, and they're going to get their Latinity, their Latin straight, by going to the very best Latin, right? To the Virgil, to the Horace, to the Ovid, which has been something of a head scratcher to some, to think of these medieval monks studying Ovid with all of his sexual license and saucy stories. But there was this thought that no one spoke more beautiful Latin than Ovid. We've got to read him, got to come to terms with him, learn from him, because he's a master of the language that is not our language. So as to set it aside, I want to say a word about copying, and then come back and say more about this introduction to the author's element of interpreting the poets and the commentary element. After you had been introduced to the authors, after you had proceeded painstakingly, sentence by sentence by sentence, then the very last part of grammar was copywork, was taking this beautiful thing that you had chewed on, that you had ruminated on, and now actually doing the back-breaking work of incarnating it. And that had all sorts of material challenges. You had to raise the sheep, and you had to scrape the vellum, and you had to find the nuts, and you had to make the ink, and then slowly, word by word, copying out the Ovid, the Virgil, whatever. I think that's really interesting because we often lead with that sort of thing with our third graders, our fifth graders, our second graders maybe. We often sort of set them to the work of copying early on, and it's interesting that there's a similar practice back when, and yet in some ways it was almost a capstone, a final thing. And please don't misunderstand me. That's not me suggesting, hey, we should go back to the way it was done. But it's interesting and worth further sort of thought and reflection that it's both present in the past, but maybe at a different point in the process of learning one's letters, of doing grammar. These first two elements, though, the accessus and the commentary, I want to kind of impersonate the grammarian, the one teaching grammar as a liberal art back in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, And then after these little bits of impersonation, of acting out, just sort of reflect on what's happening there, how it could go. And so, well, we've got to find an auctor, right? We've got to find an authority. And so for us, I think oftentimes when we're thinking about teaching students their letters, the elements, when we're talking about the poets that the students ought to read, we're usually thinking of those who are excellent, those who are great in our own tongue. So I've decided to denominate Robert Louis Stevenson, Beatrix Potter, and William Shakespeare as our auctors this morning. And on the handout, I Latinized their name to really give them auctoritas, right? I mean, they're really sort of authorities. And so say that it was time to have the students encounter that venerable authority, William Shakespeare. I mean, he is an authority, right? All of the disputes about, canon and what students should read and what should be taught, I think that for the most part, people on all sides of those debates agree that Shakespeare's in. He's still held in some esteem by all sides on those debates. And that was evidenced for me last night when I went to dinner. Really enjoyed my first ever experience of Cincinnati, to those of you who are local. And I was walking down the street after having enjoyed some good Indian food, and who should I find sitting on a park bench but William Shakespeare, a statue of him sitting there with his arm out. I sat next to him, we embraced. It was really lovely. I don't know what the name of this district is, but I had a lot of fun there. Went and saw a comedy show, bought a record. It was, 2 cheers for Cincinnati. I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan, so. Sorry. Okay, I digress. So Shakespeare is an auctor. So how would this sort of introduction to the authorities be handled back when? The teacher might come in and say something like, "Today, students, we will study, right, the great Shakespeare. This Shakespeare lived in Britannia during the reign of Elizabeth I and James I. In antique Britannia, the barbarians who shook their spears at the Romans, those Romans who would inevitably conquer them, gained the name Shakespeares. And this Gulielmus, or William Shakespeare, was so named because he exercised such spear shaking with a strength of will, donning a helm, a will helm, to fight against any who would besiege that which is good and true." That's totally fanciful, right? Those are all made up etymologies. That's not really what William is about. That's not really what Shakespeare is about. And medieval grammarians loved fanciful etymologies. They weren't really concerned about the fine-grained etymological linguistic detail. They thought, they had a providential reading of things in which, of course, it would be fitting for William Shakespeare to be named in this manner because he turned out to be so great. Do I think we should, make up fanciful etymologies of the authors we're reading for our students today in grammar class and literature class? I don't. But I do think that sort of the reverence, the enthusiasm we show for the auctor can be infectious, right? He's so great. And in fact, I think the medieval grammarian would go on, "While this Gulielmus wrote narrative poems, he is best known as a playwright. The Greek for maker is poetes, poet, and an English word for a laborer who makes is a wright. Shakespeare, a son of a glover, a glove-wright, humbly plied his trade. He was a wright of plays, while his fellow Englishmen were often shipwrights and wheelwrights." Okay, so why do we like Shakespeare? Because he's a playwright. What does that actually mean? And perhaps your students would actually spell playwright correctly after being told what right means and where it comes from. But lest we think of him as a mere sort of workaday laborer, a noble profession, but not how we often think of a poet, the medieval grammarian would go on. Yet he, Shakespeare, is also remembered as a vates, a bard, a seer, who, as he smithed together words, had a perspicacity and a skill in expressing what he saw. In fact, in our humble English tongue, Shakespeare is not merely a bard, he is the bard. Okay, so this introduction is supposed to kind of hype up the room. Like, the students are supposed to be really excited to read this guy, which seems like a good pedagogical strategy, because it's, now it's time to start to get tedious. The introduction to the author would continue by talking about the genre of the work to be studied, the subject matter, the characters, the number of books, the lessons we ought to look for, and the part of philosophy to which the work belonged. I think for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into those details, but just in passing, I think many of those things are still things we do. If you're a teacher of Shakespeare in high school, in middle school, you want to acquaint the students with the basic plot structure, the basic characters. Sometimes you're reading a Shakespearean comedy, it's all these Italian names, they all sound the same, you've never heard these names before. So part of your work as the teacher is to enumerate, who are the characters, how can we keep this set of, personae of the drama, how can we keep them straight? What action can we expect to unfold? And so if we can get that off the table and have that understanding, then we can get into the genius of Shakespeare in his development of characters, in his use of language. So I think there's a lot of overlap between contemporary practices and the way grammar was taught as a liberal art. The one difference is the shoehorning of lessons. So the medieval grammarian, this work that we're reading of King Lear is designed by the great Shakespeare to show us the folly of trusting in false gods, the harm that comes to the state through familial strife, the fickleness of fortune. For those of us who love literature in all of its many layered meanings, in its sometimes rich ambiguities and openness to interpretation, that feels forced, right? That feels, or at least premature, to just sort of state that as the governing reading of the play before we begin. And I would suggest that I think we do better as contemporary teachers of letters, of grammar, to not short-circuit students' encounter with the text through such moralizing. It may be, in fact, that such morals can be drawn out, but let's first just have students meet the story that's going to sort of stir their feelings and engage their imagination, and through that process, right, more subtly let them be shaped, let them come up with an opinion, let them sort of suggest, I think that Shakespeare is having Lear fail in this way because he's always praying to these pagan gods that Shakespeare would have thought to be false, or whatever the case might be. I think we've grown pedagogically by at least delaying those kinds of readings, if not removing them. If there's a lot of similarities between the way that grammar as a liberal art introduced the authors and the way we might do so now, I think the big departure, the big difference is now in the second part, in the commentary, the explanatio, wherein we're going to get into the most small details of the language. I know that some of you in the back or over on this side, can't see this sentence, when thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness, very well, but it's on your handout too, in bold. And we can imagine the teacher maybe beginning, last time students, we covered the two sentences, no, 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 come, let's away to prison, we two alone will sing like birds in the cage. The teacher might even remind the students of a couple things observed. For instance, I think something really fascinating in those earlier sentences is the use of away. So you get an adverb that's replacing, there ought to be a verb there. Right? It should be something like, come, let's go. And instead, we no longer have a verb, but an adverb. That's the figure of speech anthemaria. And so I can imagine that there had been a discussion of that. And part of the grammarian's job as a guardian of good language would be to communicate to the students whether that kind of substitution was only allowed to the great or was something that we all should do. So there was sort of an interesting way in which the grammar teacher was offering norms. So like, you ought not do that unless you reach sort of the point of being a Shakespeare yourself. I think that's nice and right. We want our students to learn the elements of grammar, not so they're always ever paralyzed. Should I begin this sentence with a coordinating conjunction? Oh no! Right, but we lay down, right, helpful, clear rules of the elements with the ultimate hope that they have possessed, right, the liberal arts where they have a certain sort of power, a certain facility, and they can choose. They can, with Abraham Lincoln, begin a sentence, and the war came. I doubt when we hear that, when we read that, well, some of us, how dare you, President Lincoln, start that sentence with and. Instead, it makes us ask, well, first of all, was it a convention in his time that you ought not start a sentence with a coordinating conjunction? Might be the first question. But the second question, if he's breaking a rule, if he's breaking a convention, well, why would you do so? And I would submit, if you're familiar with that passage, the and there does a lot of work towards suggesting the providence of the Civil War, right? That one side sought to avert it, the other side sought to stir it, and this happened and that happened and the other happened. Nobody wanted it, and the war came. And there's something about that choice, right? Rather than a conjunctive adverb, therefore, moreover, nevertheless, right? The simple monosyllable and does real work through the breakage. So, students, right, are you going to tell them never ever substitute an adverb for a verb? Or are you going to say, Shakespeare did this, you should do it too? Probably depends on the age of the students, how sort of wild of a choice it is that Shakespeare has made. Shakespeare's just so good that I can't even get to this sentence, when thou dost ask me blessing. Just again, the teacher might remind students how we reflected on we two alone, because of course that's absurd, right? Two is not alone. One is alone. How can two be alone? So what's going on with that paradox that Shakespeare has crafted? Finally, then the teacher might get to the sentence of the day. The students would read it aloud, and then we would dig in. What all would be done? The first thing that would probably be done would be an identification of the parts of speech of the passage. When is a subordinating conjunction, and thou is a singular pronoun, and dost is a helping verb, and ask is a verb, and so on and so forth. There'd be this sort of word by word, what's the part of speech, and maybe we'd begin simply by saying that when is a conjunction, and then we'd have a conversation about how it's a subordinating conjunction rather than a coordinating conjunction. And that then might bring us to a consideration of how the first line is a dependent clause that can't stand alone and is in some way subordinate to the more important element, the independent clause. I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. I think there would be interesting sorts of debates, for instance, about what part of speech me is. Because is it when thou dost ask me blessing, is me an indirect object pronoun, or is it a poetical way of saying my blessing? Or is it both in different respects at the same time? So this fine-grained work of the parts of speech, I think, would invite a lot of questions, and a lot of questions about, so the speaker here, by the way, is King Lear. You know, what is the character trying to communicate, and what is the auctor, Shakespeare, up to? After the parts of speech one by one, then the next activity would be to provide a synonym for each of the words, and as necessary, see how the authority has chosen the better word. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a Romantic poet who went to Christ's Hospital, a school for poor children in London, has stories of how they would come in day by day to school and open up their Homer in Greek, and the teacher would just sort of choose a random word, and the student would have to give account of why the Homeric diction, why Homer's word choice was better than any possible Greek synonym. So that would be interesting here for, if, you know, to sort of conflate olden days and today. I think you'd have an interesting conversation about thou with students, because we can imagine an alternative like you, when you ask me blessing. So why is it that Shakespeare chooses thou? Is it because he's so full of himself? He loves the old flowery language? Is it because it's grand? Or more grammatically, more basically, in Shakespeare's time, thou would indicate clearly the singular, and you would suggest the plural. And in fact, part of this exercise at some point would be to take all the declinable words and to offer their full declension. So in this case, the teacher might say, the nominative singular, the subjective singular of this word is thou, and thy or thine is the possessive singular, the genitive singular, and thee is the objective singular, and on it would go to you or ye, yours and your, and you in the plural. And so you'd learn all sorts of things in seeing all the different sorts of forms of the word. But then it would bring us to the point of reflecting on why would King Lear, why would Shakespeare choose thou over you or ye? Well, because this is a super intimate moment, right? We two alone. This is Lear and Cordelia having lost a battle in prison together, having been reconciled, right? There's this forgiveness element. It would be peculiar to address her with y'all. When y'all dost ask me, he's not looking for his blessing to y'all, right? It's very intimate and focused, and so that's why the auctor would go with thou, not just because he loves the sound of the older language or something like that. There's a very particular purpose. And so, again, I think an interesting conversation would come with the word ask. Students could generate lots of synonyms. What makes ask better than request or beg, something like this? Students, when thinking about these alternatives, might notice we've got almost all monosyllables and almost all Germanic words, very few Latinate words here. So, blessing rather than benediction, for instance. So what is Shakespeare doing with the sort of earthy Germanic monosyllables? Maybe that's a reason for ask. Or instead, request doesn't capture the possibility of begging or pleading. And so ask has both the potential for this pleading, this imploring element without getting a messy long word like implore put in there. So all the synonyms and all the declensions would be the next part of the activity. Hereafter, well, I guess the other thing is, right, the grammar teacher was always to make these digressions upon history, upon philosophy, upon morals, so that I think, right, there would be interesting things to say about blessing and forgiveness. Hans Urs von Balthasar remarked in the 20th century that Shakespeare is and remains the poet of forgiveness. So, what is the sort of, why are we moved by this? What are the dynamics of this scene with this foolish old man, this once king, asking his daughter forgiveness when she might ask his blessing? So definitely some lessons to draw, some things to muse upon and rest with on that level. Thereafter, this is poetry, and so the next job would be to scan it. So Shakespeare, when he wrote verse in drama, mostly wrote iambic pentameter. Famous line that's clearly in iambic pentameter, right? To be or not to be, that is the question. So could we do similar things here? You'll see on the sheet that the line is actually enjambed. It actually is not as I have written it here. But think about, what's stressed and unstressed. Does Shakespeare divert from that iambic pentameter structure? What might that mean? What's he up to? So to take an example of where a divergence from that structure is really important, a different moment later in the play, King Lear has a line of pentameter, a 5-foot line, where he simply says the word never 5 times. Never, never, never. Unlike to be, where the second part of the foot is emphasized, in the word never, first part of the foot that's emphasized, not the second part. So students, what's going on to have a line that totally, utterly reverses the usual flow? Right, to be or not to be, it runs along, it skips along, right? Never, never, right? It's hitting the brakes, it's reversing, it's despairing. There's this intersection between the poetic form and the meaning of the word and the meaning of the moment. Seeing those kinds of departures by scanning, by attending to the poetic rhythm would be revelatory. Here also, I broke the 5-foot structure because I think another thing that then the teacher would turn to is figures of speech. And there is this balancing between the two clauses that we might call the figure of speech antithesis, that you're communicating these contrary ideas through these sets of balanced phrases. And so I think the teacher would want to draw that out, explain how the two are balanced and what sort of effect that creates. There's a certain sort of rhythm achieved through the symmetry and a certain sort of presentation of the contrary ideas through that symmetry. Finally, after having done all of that and focused on a few other figures of speech as well, so I think we'd probably return to this me and name it and say, that's right, if the meaning of me is my, then that's the figure of speech analogy, and we'd want to explain what analogy is, give some other examples of it. After all of that, then the teacher would wrap up the day by what further lessons there are to draw from this. And it might be something about how you should act when someone requests your blessing, or how you ought to seek forgiveness when you mess up. And I think while well beyond what the medieval grammar teacher would have done, I'd be very interested to get students on their feet, actually get them think about different ways that you might stage this and how that might suggest slightly different interpretations as well. And okay, the day's class is over, and now next day you come back, and once you finally pass through the whole text, some people in the room are equipped now to copy it with this depth of understanding. In conclusion, two things. First of all, I think that oftentimes today we skip over the really close reading part, right? People don't have the grammatical knowledge often to get into that level of detail. And I think that level of detail actually opens up all sorts of riches in the poets. I think that's something we could sort of take from grammar as a liberal art in the past. Secondly, I think when we put these two parts of the liberal art of grammar together, the elements and the interpretation of the poets, we're giving students something, as the quote at the very bottom suggests, something that's pulcher, that's beautiful. And so another aspect of grammar as a liberal art is that it's especially attentive to beautiful language and the way that poetic language gives beautiful representations, beautiful stories, and that's distinct from the way that logic, for instance, can help students grasp truth, or rhetoric can help students communicate or grasp the good. There's something about the liberality of grammar that I think allows students to really grow in understanding, receiving, marveling at, and sharing the beautiful. And so I think that's a very fitting place to end. Thanks so much for your kind attention. We do have a couple minutes for questions.
If you enjoyed this lecture, we encourage you to visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu, for additional information on upcoming Hoogland Center events and other free resources for educators.